This is Let Me Sum Up, your annual deep dive into the Australian Government's federal budget. I'm Luke Menzel, recording on Budget Night from Ghana land, and as the clock ticks ever closer to midnight, I'm joined by my two co-hosts. From our nation's capital, it is the Let Me Sum Up podcast Parliament House correspondent, Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
Good evening, gents. I am here on Ngunnawal country today, and it's been a day. Budget days usually are. I've been awake for far too long, but such is our dedication to you, summer operas. You are the only thing preventing me from falling down onto a bed and not getting up in the next little while. Let's do this.
Such are the rash promises we made on the fly in our last episode before we examined our diaries and realised literally the only time we could record this episode was about, 10:15 on budget night itself.
Could asterisk after normal day job work complete. Oh my God. Yes.
All right. Well, as you would expect, and as is tradition, we also have a man holding the blanket fort, scouring the budget papers from his fortress of pop culture references. It is none other than Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant.
Hello, Luke. It has been a long day for me too, including this morning scrambling to produce a briefing for our group members on many climate and energy topics, including a budget preview where 2 out of my 3 predictions for what would be in the budget were completely wrong. And that's the track record I bring tonight.
Wow. Okay. Well, way to sell the expectations. On this week's show, in the shadow of the 2025 federal election, we are giving you the hottest of hot takes on the climate and energy elements of the 2025 federal budget. Such as they are, Frankie, you have been saying for a while you weren't expecting a lot from this budget when it comes to climate and energy, but you've been in Parliament House all day and spent the afternoon and evening in the budget lockup. Were there any surprises for you in this budget?
I mean, I don't know that it's necessarily good to say that I feel validated that my forecast.
So, unlike some co-hosts
right.
on this podcast, your predictions were accurate.
Yes, but again, I'm not sure that that's something I necessarily want to be crowing about too much. So, before I rub Tennant's nose in it even further, shall we just deal with the macro really quick? Because obviously our summer operas are more interested in the climate and energy content of said budget. But just foreshadowing that that's a little light on this year. I think everyone, I think more or less acknowledged that this was a budget that we certainly didn't expect to be having. That was certainly the impression that people like us who engage with Treasury officials and people who are involved in the production of these documents just a few weeks ago looking pretty relaxed and like they were not going to be rushing to produce a large chunky set of budget papers in a couple of weeks and then all of a sudden had to scramble because the ex-tropical cyclone, was it Alfred in the end? It's too many names ago. Sort of put the kibosh on an April election. And so the way to view this budget is nothing more than like a pre-game warm-up, really. You can view it as an election budget, but actually a lot of the things that I think would be expecting from the government in terms of its election announcements aren't really there yet. To the extent that they haven't already been announced. So because we know that the government was working towards the original plan of an April election, some really big ticket items were already announced a while ago, like the Medicare spend and things like that. So everyone was sort of curious to know what was going to be in this budget for punters. And the answer to that is 2 new tax cuts, which I think you have to sort of take the hat off to members of the government for not getting any leaks on that. Like, I think you would normally expect details of a headline budget measure like that to leak ahead of time, but that landed as, if not a surprise, maybe a little unexpected, but not surprising in the context of where we are. So,
although given how quickly it was all put together, I mean, maybe it didn't leak because they only came up with it the night before.
That is, I mean, I don't want to speculate further for fear of tainting my record at correctly speculating about these things. But
I can't be any more tainted than I already am. The stench of inaccuracy hangs thick around my budget pronouncements.
Yeah. So, I'm just going to let you be smelly over there while I relay the details. So the tax cut, I think you could view it as like a classic Labor-focused tax cut. It applies to the income band between 18 grand and 45 grand, and it's going to lower over a couple of years, 1% a year. So it doesn't happen straight away, and it is very much, whilst all taxpayers that earn over 18 grand will earn that amount, it's like clearly more targeted towards lower middle income earners. So I think that really puts the opposition in an interesting position, given over the last few weeks they've been want to just match spending announcements from the government. So I think it's going to be super interesting to see what Peter Dutton says in his budget in reply speech on Thursday night. And like, I can't remember a time in recent history when a budget in reply speech was something that people were looking forward to and expected to be a bit of a milestone in terms of forming up a campaign. But I very much think, because there aren't a lot of other big hitting items in this budget, like there's stuff we can talk about, but really not a hell of a lot new. I think it really then sort of puts the onus on the opposition to respond to that tax cut and other things that the government's put in this budget, and then come forward with their own economic agenda. And there's plenty of speculation out there from others that there's not too much substance to that so far.
So possibly while you were on your way back to your hotel room, Frankie, I can report that Angus Taylor has been on the ABC and has rejected that tax cut, said they won't be supporting it. The diligent ABC journo that was interrogating him responded with, well, does that mean no income tax cuts from the opposition in this election campaign? And he said, I didn't say that.
Yeah, so hence my comment about this being, I think, more of a classic Labor-focused measure. So, I think let's wait and see what the coalition has to say on Thursday. But, beyond that, I mean, I'm not going to go into climate and energy because we're going to talk about that as a group. But beyond that, sort of broad macroeconomic stats like population growth, well, that's moderating, but nothing kind of wild and crazy there. It's sort of returning to a still slightly higher than pre-COVID situation. There is an underlying deficit of 27 billion this year and 42 billion next year. But even the 42 billion for next year is not that far off what was forecast last year. So there's just sort of there's not like a big narrative, I think, to draw out of some of those headline economic figures. And in terms of things like decisions taken but not yet announced, which is the sort of catch-all for measures where, government might be building, like sort of stacking their war chest for election announcements, but they won't put specific line items against those things. there's not a huge amount in the budget. It's about $1.5 billion in payments over the forward estimates, which for an election campaign is probably not as much as you'd think, although being only minimally familiar with the dark arts of how these things are put together, decisions can just not be taken. So I wouldn't put too much stock in that figure particularly. So it could be more.
Not taken and not announced, Frankie.
That's right. Yeah. Like, I mean, I feel like that's a dark place for us to go to with that kind of speculation, but it's a bit lower than maybe some pundits who watch these things closely might expect. And my comment back to you is I think there's like other ways that those things can be hidden in these papers. So let's wait and see what the next few weeks hold. The other thing that's just sort of remarkable from more of a macro perspective is that there's a lot of commentary on, global headwinds and challenging trade conditions and national security and like all of that. There's a lot of discussion of it in the papers, and there's almost zero in terms of measures, and I think that just speaks to the fact that this government had a couple of weeks to throw this thing together, and whilst they weren't wanting to ignore that context entirely, there isn't a lot of targeted spending or kind of things that are tied to like that sort of looming situation, if you like, which is also striking too.
And I suppose that to the degrees that, the Trump tariff agenda is roiling the global economy, that has hit a lot harder than many experts actually expected it to. I think that there are a lot of people that expected that to be the shimmerer that it was under Trump 1.0, and it's very clear that the Trump administration is taking that agenda much, much more seriously than they did last time, and we're adjusting in real time, right? And I'm not sure that Australia necessarily has a super, well thought through or coherent response at the ready. I don't think that is a criticism of the government. I don't know that anyone really does yet, and that's something that will evolve over coming months and years.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to kind of get us into climate and energy land, like the smallest wink to that particular issue comes like broadly under the banner of Future Made in Australia, but is a Buy Australia initiative. It's a campaign. So it's like there's $20 million that's been hypothecated to the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet for initiatives that would encourage consumers to buy Australian-made products. That is like a new thing that's come through the budget. But I mean, $20 million isn't going to go too far when you're considering the potential reach of some of those tensions and things like tariffs and things like that. But I think that's a first acknowledgement that there's going to be this kind of nationalistic response and kind of pushback from the government. So
there was not as much in this budget overall as there often is in budgets, and there wasn't a lot of drama around climate and energy measures in this budget. There are a couple of things of note that are in there. There's a statement in budget paper number 1, statement 3, fiscal strategy and outlook, that accounts for net zero related measures and says new measures in the mid-year economic and fiscal outlook for 24-25 and the 25-26 budget together amount to $4.3 billion of new measures just in the forward estimates, and a touch under $7 billion over the medium term. But a lot of that stuff has already been announced. If I just zip through that list, some extra money they've tipped into rewiring the nation, $1.2 billion. They've added an extra $2 billion of capital to the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. There was $500 million for expanding the SHEPI, the Social Housing Energy Performance Initiative. Some numbers not for publication, which could be anything really. They could be remarkably big or not, around support for Australian-made metals in the near term, but that's $2 billion in the medium term, and a financing facility for green investments in Southeast Asia and partnering with Southeast Asia. Who knows what that amounts to? Beyond that, I mean, the headline things: energy bill relief, various bits of green energy or green industry rather policy that have been announced, and we can go through the guts of those two. And then, I don't know, tucked in around the sides, there was, $3 billion for the much discussed, perhaps mourned, perhaps lauded Morgian skate, which is the roadkill, hopefully not literally, in the move to make sure that the Tasmanian farmed salmon industry can keep farming it up. That's kind of it in terms of included measures. Are you champing at the bit, Luke, to dive into energy bill relief? I do believe I saw you quoted with some in a paper with some thoughts on what could have been done with that money instead.
Yeah, sure. Like, I can pick that up. I guess what I would say overall, what we're sharing. Overarching thoughts. I think, Frankie, you've been saying for a little while that this would be a cost of living election, and I think we can say unequivocally that is the government's view as well.
How right can Frankie be? It's becoming frightening.
I'm lapping it up.
I mean, it's probably not the most novel of takes that any of us have ever had.
Way to kill my buzz, Menzel.
But you have been the champion of this take on this very podcast, and you deserve credit. But it's true. I mean, the big ticket items in this budget, and indeed in the lead up to this budget, and one of the reasons why it isn't super interesting is because heaps of the really big ticket items, many of them health related, because the government is really seeking to move the election onto ground that it is comfortable, have been focused on that cost of living lens. This $1.8 billion of energy bill relief is an extension of previous measures over the last couple of budgets. We know that for all kinds of reasons, there has been a lot of pressure on energy prices and the energy bills that have been flowing through to consumers. One of the ways that the government has responded has been providing these subsidies, not means tested, flowing through to households right around the country. I think, to be very clear, there's been a case for that sort of support flowing to consumers. In a perfect world, that would have been means tested. There was an argument that was being prosecuted by the government that was very hard to do. I heard a lot about that in the first round of subsidies, and thought that was pretty reasonable. When the second round of subsidies came, well, I thought, okay, one would have hoped you'd done a bit more work on that. But fair enough. The third round of subsidies roll around and there hasn't been any effort made to work out how to means test these things. You're going, oh, okay, well, obviously a little bit more effort could have been expended on that front. And the reason I make that point is because there's other things one could do with that money. And, you're referencing the AFR article that myself and a few other luminaries were opining about some of the other things that one could have spent that sort of money on. And, it's a fairly simple exercise to fire up the spreadsheet and work out how much it costs to install a heat pump hot water system, or install a reverse cycle air conditioner, or do a comprehensive thermal performance upgrade. But if the government was going to pay for the whole thing, $6.8 billion would buy you the cost of purchasing and installing 2.9 million reverse cycle air conditioners or 1.6 million heat pump hot water systems, or it'd allow you to do 2.4 million thermal efficiency upgrades. But of course, you probably wouldn't be paying for the full cost of those upgrades. You'd be providing some kind of incentive or subsidy. And so, there'd be some skin in the game for the households out there. So you'd be upgrading even more homes. Now, it is fair to say that in terms of an immediate cost of living crisis and, acknowledging that deployment pathways are a thing and you need to scale these things up in a sensible way, and you can't upgrade, 2 million plus homes overnight, it's not an effective and immediate response. The point that I was making in some of those comments was that there's a pivot point. It is appropriate to find the pivot point where you shift from one-off subsidies that are incredibly expensive and unsustainable to support for the community to drive down bills permanently. So that was the point I was making. And, I think it'll probably be left to the next government to pick up that agenda and run with it. But I think it's something that we need to remind governments of all stripes that there's that opportunity, and they need to be very mindful of it when they're considering some of these investments over time.
Can I give you my latest hot take on that? I view this measure in this budget, although I agree, I think it should have been means tested. They've effectively halved the hand out of the subsidy. So I think this is them trying to wean people off it. And my hope would be that the next time we see an announcement from government on something that's focused around energy bills for consumers, it is something of a more structural nature. We've speculated on that kind of stuff on the podcast before. I think for an election budget, it would have been pretty tough for a government who's, for better or worse, created expectation over the last couple of cycles with this, to cut things off a few weeks before people go to vote. So I think it's pure pragmatism, and I'd hope that this is maybe the last time we're seeing something like this that isn't targeted towards the people who need it most.
Well, so two thoughts there. One is, it is certainly possible. The polls are sort of 50-50 or the average of polls is 50-50 as we speak. It is certainly possible that the next government energy affordability initiative that is presented is indeed a structural measure. It is to transform the energy system with steaming great heaps of nuclear energy, which I am told will cut people's power bills by of the order of 43%. I believe that was a rolled gold election promise on the Insiders program a month ago. Very well advised, very well delivered response indeed. Second thought is that this measure was probably made inevitable by the fact that retail electricity prices have not come down nearly as much as everybody will have hoped. And in fact, in New South Wales and Queensland and South Australia, based on the draft default market offer that was released a couple of weeks ago from the Australian Energy Regulator, prices are going back up. They're not going up nearly as much as they did a couple of years ago. And there's a lot of moving parts in all that. New South Wales seems to have the steepest price increases in the region of 8%, depending on which distribution area you're in. But it's not the narrative that the federal government will have wanted, and taking the edge off those increases, I think is surely their feeling of the least they could do to confront that. Of course, Victoria, its version of a default offer is in real terms declining. It's less than 1% increase in nominal terms for households and just under 3% for small business. Different method, slightly different dynamics. But overall, that cost picture is just like we're treading water or sinking very slightly beneath the waves, and it's a bad place to be. Something definitely for the next term of office to keep working on turning around.
Well, I take both your points. I guess where I'm coming from is that it's not suggesting a government barrelling towards an election starts to tell itself that this reckless spending must stop. Like that is...
To coin a phrase.
That would be odd behaviour. Like, they are where they are and the situation is what it is. The point is that, the way you get to a point where you are in a position to do those sorts of upgrades is by starting early in a term to kind of create the deployment pathways, to get the structures in place, to get the partnerships in place with states. I think this government overall has done a lot of good things on climate and energy. They've built a bunch of enabling infrastructure. There have been some very, very significant programs that have been put in place, as well as new policies. But on this specific topic of residential energy performance, the Home Energy Upgrade Fund, a significant initiative, but it hasn't supported a whole lot of activity out in the market yet. And so, whoever's on the government benches after this election really needs to turn their attention to how they deal with this big national task that we have before us about how we transform the residential housing stock. And when you crunch the numbers, you can achieve quite a lot, which means that when you get to these crunch points, it's having a less of an impact on consumers. But you can't do it. You can't turn that tap on, 5 minutes to midnight. Yeah. You have to start early and just start working through that task.
Whether it's the spinning up of substantial upgrades or the development of a capability to do more targeted bill relief, if you don't start, you never get any closer.
So 2 thoughts on that. One, it was good to see, although it had been previously announced, a top-up for the SHEPI program, which is, I'm going to get the acronym wrong because it's been a long day.
Social Housing Energy Performance Initiative.
That one. Yes. So that's funding from the Commonwealth to be matched by states to a point for energy upgrades to social housing across the country. To my mind, if they did things well, that's part of the incubator, right? The rollout of some of those upgrades to skilling up that sort of services industry ecosystem that we need. I still feel like even though that work's been happening for a couple of years now, it's still early days, and you get different stories out of different states in the way that those upgrades have been targeted. Some are focused very much on specific attributes kind of broadly across social housing. Some states, I think Victoria, might be doing fewer but more deeper retrofits. So there hasn't been a one-size-fits-all approach across the country, but all of that experience would be useful to inform a broader program. The other thought is the thing that didn't feature in this budget but was widely speculated, which was, a program geared towards households, where a lot of the early speculation has been that that's around a battery subsidy for homeowners. I mean, look, to my mind, that is very much a campaign announcement thing. You'd want to get a big bang out of announcing something like that. I think we talked on this podcast together about our various views on the merits of a battery-only subsidy program versus wanting to see a broader suite of energy efficiency and electrification measures. I'm not sure, but I reckon by now our dear listeners know broadly where we fall along that spectrum.
I think there's room for more views.
There's room for more views. Well, go on.
No. You're put the base case for battery only pretty mediocre.
Yeah. So look, I think if this is a nature of program like we've seen with bill relief and things like that isn't targeted or means tested or whatever, it's very likely if you did something like opened up the SRES, the small renewable energy target, to batteries, you're going to get people in middle and higher incomes predominantly accessing that incentive. And so is that an equitable way of doing this? If it's about cutting people's energy bills, my view would be no. One argument floating around is that a battery-only subsidy is sort of less about people's bills and more about the role of batteries supporting overall kind of system security, if you like. And that's a very different rationale for running a program like that. And then just to state the bleeding obvious, or points that I have certainly made on this podcast before, I think it would be a crying shame to launch out a big program and ignore the much more fundamental low-hanging fruit of energy efficiency incentives that would lower people's bills forever, regardless of whether they had solar, and the prospect of batteries on their homes. There are a lot of co-benefits to focusing on energy efficiency, particularly when you're looking at things like draft proofing and insulating. It goes to how comfortable people feel in their homes. And, and the overall kind of need, if you like, for the capacity of solar systems and battery and things like that needed on a home, if you can minimise the energy demand altogether. My opening and somewhat obvious thoughts.
Luke, I think you're on Team Frankie here.
Yeah, more or less. I mean, I'm not sure how much time we want to spend critiquing a policy that, to my knowledge, hasn't been announced by either major party yet.
It's the curious case of the battery incentive program in the nighttime. It didn't bark.
Look, I have no quarrel with batteries. I just think that they're part of a mix, and you want to take a holistic view of the various measures that are going to benefit households and the grid. We've talked quite a bit about the value of thermal performance upgrades for the grid, particularly at those critical times between 6 and 9 p.m. The sort of load that you're putting on the grid when you're heating or cooling homes around the country, that's very significant. It is grid infrastructure. That's very important. It's also the quality of electrification, and the efficiency of the electric appliances that you're putting on the grid is something that governments should be very mindful of. We do need to electrify, but how we do that's incredibly important. Storage has a place, I think particularly in Australia, where we have really high penetration of rooftop solar. It makes sense that you'd want a bit of infrastructure dotted around the place that is able to shift some of that generation to times of the day where it's a little bit more useful. But it's about managing that investment and making sure that you're right-sizing that investment like you're right-sizing everything else on the grid, and just leaping immediately to batteries as the solution, and the first among equals when there's so much else to support in terms of household energy performance, I think it is not a sensible approach. So we will see. That is my pre-bottle of any potential future government or opposition policies in this space.
Well, more to provide variety than because I deeply disagree. Because I think you guys are mostly right. I mostly agree. But the best case that I could put for doing a big small battery thing has got a couple of legs to it. One is, hey, don't badmouth middle-class welfare. Middle-class welfare built the solar PV revolution. If it weren't for grasping, allegedly soft-hearted, certainly sharp-elbowed middle-class households grabbing all manner of incentives with both hands, solar would not be as deployed and cheap as it is today. So yay for that. I could even give like a Friedrich Hayek argument for the diffusion of new innovations and technologies from upper economic echelons to poorer ones. But whatever, I'm sure that's a popular argument.
A popular argument with some of our
so
mates.
Great. So great. No, the thing that I will put a little more serious weight on is that batteries are happening. Like, there is a revolution going on in the scale of manufacture, the cost of manufacture, the cost of deployment of batteries. We haven't seen a lot of that really impact household scale batteries as yet. The action has all been in grid scale and automotive EV batteries. But this is a place where costs can come down, are coming down for many formats a lot. And so it's kind of ripe to go very big in a lot of new niches in a way that, like a lot of other very sensible things, are not getting cheaper or easier quite as fast. It's become, I don't know, if anything, harder to get a lot of the elements of a sensible home retrofit done in the last few years with tight labour markets and tight supply chains and a lot of broader cost inflation. And so the temptation to just like go hard, go big, go batteries, because that looks very scalable and costs coming down and just easier than doing deep, but still hard stuff. That's an understandable temptation. But like, even if all that was true, you're totally right that something that was A, accessible only to a relatively narrow privileged slice of the population, and B, didn't come with any strings attached on, is this actually a good appliance, well installed, that's going to be used in ways that generate wider benefits and not just narrow for the installer installing household benefits. Like, yeah, you'd want all that stuff. And if you could get in there and do some other things that make very basic sense and are quite cheap at the same time, boy, that'd be good. And also, of course, if there is an incentive, it ought to cover the battery inclusive induction cooktops that I'm obsessed with, not just like standalone batteries sitting there battering it up and not cooking your breakfast.
I always appreciate when at least one of us kind of, if not disagrees, kind of tests the rationale for some of our I don't want to call it groupthink, because I all think we're pretty strong-minded individuals here. But your last comment though goes to like another thing I would throw into the mix, which is we need to be like, especially with potentially big dollar programs, you need to think about how you can maximize benefits across multiple policy imperatives. And I think in the context of gas shortages forecast, particularly in Victoria, potentially elsewhere as well, it also makes sense that that any sort of retrofit program be targeted on alleviating demand for gas in homes through smart electrification and all the other things you said, because whacking a battery on the side of a house isn't going to reduce the demand for gas if you have a gas hot water system or heating system. So doing something that's going to help with other policy imperatives as well, I think would be a smart way of looking at it.
If the battery catches fire, that house's heating problems are solved.
Well, at least for a short time.
That was a cheap shot. I withdraw.
Oh boy!
All right. Are there any other policies not announced in this budget which we want to critique tonight? I mean, we've got all night.
Well, I've got two. I've got two little things to critique that weren't in there.
Damn you.
Well, we can deal with it very quickly. There wasn't anything on the next wave of climate policy. And the reason for that is that decisions on sector plans and 2035 emissions targets have been deferred. I would expect to see emerging initiatives under a government that's interested in 2035 targets in the next several budgets that relate to those things. The other thing that wasn't in there that, I don't know, like if it's going to happen, somebody's going to have to come back pretty quickly. There wasn't anything in there to do with funding for Australia's potential hosting of COP31 next November or November next year.
And looking increasingly likely given what's going on in Turkey right now, right?
Yeah. Imprisoning your leading electoral rival. Not a great look.
Yikes.
For popularity in the Western Europe and others regional grouping.
Yikes. I missed that. Up to my eyeballs in budget papers, apparently.
Yes, well, the mayor of Istanbul is now up to his eyeballs in prison.
Sorry, I shouldn't laugh. That's terrible. I am delirious.
So, like, if Australia is not, like, actively ripping up its commitment to the Paris Agreement, you'd think we were a pretty good shot at hosting next year. And it's not going to be cheap. There'll be a bunch of economic benefits, but somebody's going to have to pony up a bunch of money for security, for logistics, for any number of things, and as well as substantive initiatives. Like you may have seen, there's a bit less international aid money flowing around the place lately, and climate aid, I think, will be under particular pressure. There's a bunch of finance pledge to increase. You know, there could be a lot of things. So should the next government want to host COP31, I reckon the MyEFO for 2025-26 is going to have a hefty item in there around that, or more than one. That's it. That was quick.
Yeah. No, and I didn't I'm trying to think where that would show up in the papers if it was kind of already hypothecated. Like, I'm guessing there would be some staffing needs, like on ASL, but it could be in the decisions taken but not yet announced bucket.
I think they've got dribs and drabs in there for, like, scenario, getting ready for the possibility that they need to get a lot more ready.
I'm out of hot takes.
But not out of hot goss, I hope.
Right. Well, we've agreed that for our Super Summer Operas, we'll be recording some special bonus content from Frankie, giving us some of the vibe from around the grounds at Parliament House and indeed inside the budget lockup. We know that Frankie is famous for her budget lockup sweets. What did she bring? There is only one way to find out. Head on over to patreon.com/Let Me Sum Up for freckle / jelly baby / I don't know, something from Haig's Watch.
I couldn't possibly comment for you regular summer uppers.
Yes, we appreciate the support, and I'm sure there will be even more insights beyond what was in Frankie's lolly bag. But shall we do one more thing that captivated our attention from these budget papers? Whether it was an actual budgeted item or a fantasy budgeted item, which seems to be the theme of this very pod. Tennant, what have you got?
All right, well, I've got something that just happened on the day of the budget rather than being in the budget, which is to note the appointment of 2 new members of Australia's Climate Change Authority. And they are Greta Stevens, who until recently was the honcho supremo of climate issues at BlueScope Steel, and has a career in steel and aluminium over the last couple of decades that brings a lot of relevant experience to CCA work on future of industrial emissions reduction. and Tim Reid, who is the most recent past president of the Business Council of Australia and was pretty active in that capacity on climate change issues during his time. Those are two significant appointments, and CCA's. They've got a full bench. I'm not sure if there's any vacancies coming up on that for like several years. So whatever the outcome of the coming election, under the very shy and retiring stewardship of Matt Keane, CCA's open for business.
Frankie, what have you got?
Well, I was just going to quickly double check this because I didn't get it in my first
You can't say something wrong at this stage.
No, I know.
You've got a track record to preserve.
I do. Holy crap. Luke, you go first. I need a minute.
Well, there was a little bit of colour that we haven't covered in the budget, so I'll just make sure that we tick that off. There was a little bit of funding for things like green industry policy, much of it already announced. We had green aluminium production credits, $2 billion over 19 years for repowering smelters with renewables. I think that'll be pretty welcome from the aluminium sector. It's obviously fractious times in global aluminium markets with some of the tariff stuff that's going on. And so a little bit of government commitment in that space, no doubt. Welcome. Also the Green Iron Investment Fund, $1 billion over 7 years. Some of that tied up, about half of that tied up with the Whyalla Steelworks. They've also committed another couple $100 million, given the particular travails that steelworks is currently undergoing, and the balance of that $1 billion are for grabs via grant applications. I think similarly to some of our previous commentary, there'll be a fair bit of back and forth over those investments in South Australia. There was zero chance that anyone was going to let that particular industry go to the wall in the shadow of an election. And, I think a reasonable argument that if you're trying to build up a green steel industry, starting with the industry that you already have and building out from it is probably a little bit easier than trying to spin up new operations over time. So I think there's some plausible industry policy rationale for those investments. So yes, a little bit happening there on the green industry policy front, noting of course that most of the infrastructure that in terms of policy and investment in that green industry space has occurred in previous budgets. This is really just a little bit of a top up to the Future Made in Australia agenda.
Nice.
All right, Frankie, how you doing over there?
So no money for the National Adaptation Plan, as far as I can see. And it always gets short shrift in any climate conversation, but it's so important. And
yes.
I just can't sort of stress enough that there was a draft National Adaptation Plan that was consulted on like early last year, and then we've not really heard boo about where that's up to. And I think if you expect some good stuff to come out of that when it's eventually published, that ought to be showing up in these budget papers too. Some of the work you would expect to flow from a national adaptation plan would be taken up in funding for key agencies like CSIRO and the Climate Service and things like that. But when it comes to sort of adaptation measures across key economic sectors, that's going to cost money. So not seeing a focus on that, whilst not surprising because the plan itself hasn't been published, I think just adds another reasonably large, big thing to the list that will need to be dealt with over the next couple of years. That's my one more thing.
All right. That is a budget wrap. What was in there? What wasn't in there that we wished was in there? What wasn't in there that we hope isn't going to be in there in the future? Thoroughly covered. Thanks, gang. We'll get into the colour and movement around Parliament House in our bonus episode this week, which will drop in the next day or so. Frankie on the ground in Parliament House. For now, all that is left for me to say is that this podcast was edited by energy professional and podcast tragic Mark Spencer from Here Media Studio. We have a mailbag at Let Me Sum Up, where we would love you to send your comments, questions and reports. We usually sum up reports. We don't sum up budgets on the regular, but our bread and butter is reports. That's great. We do that. Send us your climate and energy reports. We'll look at them and talk about them on this here pod. And at letmesumup.net, we have a full back catalogue of episodes and links to all things we talked about today, which is just the budget, so you can probably find that yourself.
I'll give you a hint. www.budget.gov.au.
We'll see you over at Patreon, or indeed, if you hang out in Apple Podcasts, you can find our bonus content there as well. But until then, for Frankie Muskovich and Tennant Reid, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.